Welcome. I'm Faye Waterman, and today my guest is Donna Burton, who is more affectionately known as Donna the Astronomer. Now, Donna's here to talk about poor old Pluto and what we need to know about Pluto. And I'm going to hand it over to Donna so she can share why we say poor old Pluto. Thank you, Donna.
Thank you, Faye. Well, most people of our generation remember when Pluto was still a planet. I'm sure you do.
Well, why isn't it referred to as a planet now?
Because it got demoted. So back in 2006, the International Astronomical Union, in a meeting over in Europe, basically was trying to define what a planet is. And the outcome of that was that Pluto is now a dwarf planet, no longer a planet. But we need to go back a little bit further in time to when they actually thought that the ninth planet existed. Now, we know that today they're again looking for planet 9, but in those days they were looking for planet X, which I sort of think is really weird since X is 10 in Roman numerals. Actually, planet 9, though, well, it was the ninth planet. See, the first half a dozen planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter and Saturn, were known to the ancients. So they were known to the Babylonians and the Chaldeans and to different people. They weren't always known by those names, particularly in other cultures other than Greece and Rome and Babylonia. Those 6 planets were known because you can actually see them in the sky, because then they moved around, and they came from the word wanderers. Well, planetos, and that's where the word planet itself came from, because these particular little stars, or what they thought were stars, would wander across the sky. So that's why they were given a different name than the other stars. And then basically, with the invention of the telescope in 1600, or the use of the telescope to look at the sky by Mr. Galileo, when he looked and he actually saw Jupiter's moons and Saturn's rings and the craters on the moon and all sorts of stuff, and got himself into loads of trouble, which is a story for another day. Then they started to do some calculations. A fellow called Kepler in the 1500s had worked out all the planetary motion laws and where everything was and how they all worked. Then by the mid-1700s, they kind of figured there had to be another planet out there. And then Uranus gets discovered with a telescope. It was the first planet to be discovered with a telescope. And then a number of people start doing calculations and think that, well, there has to be something else out there because nothing works properly. The perturbations in the orbits are different, so there has to be another gravitational force. And then they found good old Neptune. And then they started calculating around. By this time, it's the turn of the 20th century, so it's the 1900s. And a fellow called Percival Lowell builds an observatory even just to try and find this planet X. And he was so determined. It was like his life's work. He was not just passionate about it, he was obsessed. And this is where Lowell Observatory came into being. And he searched for it. And photography came into being in the late 1880s. So they were using photography to do this. Sort of, it's a bit hard to look at the sky. And the problem is, the sky, once you started using photography, you're able to see many, many more stars because the photograph could actually pick up more detail. And so they searched and searched. He died around 1915. Now, we'll come back to just before he died later on. And anyway, after he died, basically the search sort of got left alone. And then in 1930, a young amateur astronomer called Clyde Tumberg applied for a job. He used to do beautiful pictures of Mars and things like that, which was one of the things that Percival Lowell was into. So he applied for a job at the Lowell Observatory to continue on. And his job was basically to take photos of the sky every night and then the next night and then compare them together. There's a common method we call blinking. So you take pictures, and we do this through to this day. These days we do a lot more with computers to find asteroids and planets out past Pluto and all that sort of stuff, and in the current search for the so-called Planet 9.
But you have more powerful equipment now than what they did back then.
Oh, yeah. We're not doing film.
Yeah.
Which is a lot better because using CCDs and you can scan them with computers a lot quicker. Yeah. And also our telescopes are a lot bigger, so we can see a lot further. The process is still the same. You take a photograph sometime apart, you then compare them together. That's how they basically found Pluto. So they found this image that moved over a couple of images, then they reconfirmed it a few months later. So it's in 1930, and so they finally announced the discovery of Pluto. Now, one of the things we do today even is when we discover something new, we go back what we call pre-covery, so things before pre-discovery images.
Yeah.
So we go back and we look at old images. And the outcome of this has been, we found out that Galileo had actually seen Uranus and not recognized it. So that Lau, in the few months before he died, had actually imaged Pluto, but didn't identify it as being Pluto because it was brighter than he thought. And this is pretty common. I remember doing a project on the 2.3 meter at Siding Spring several years ago, and we were looking at the dwarf planet Haumea as it transited in front of another star. This is a very rare event. And we were one of 3 telescopes in the world looking at it. The night before, we thought we'd better find it so we could make sure we're all right for the night, because that's how you do things. And like, I had all the coordinates and a modern computer that was, a modern telescope and everything else. And I almost missed Haumea because it was brighter than I thought it was. And this is a tiny little football-shaped planet well out past Pluto. So it's very easy to see how a number of people in the images before had actually missed identifying Pluto. So over the couple of nights, it hadn't moved very far. Then when you looked at it more and more nights, you could actually start to work out its orbit. And then they had a great big competition on what to name this planet. And I mean, if you think about the 1930s, it's between the 2 wars, it's the Great Depression time. So this was really a big thing for people. And I think this is what's caused a lot of the current emotion, the emotional uproar in 2006 about the demotion of Pluto. Pluto got named. It got named by a young girl. Her last name was Burney. Her dad was a lecturer at a university in England, and he wrote to his friend over in the other observatory. And so it became Pluto. Now, we all now relate Pluto to the dog in Walt Disney. And
Yes.
It's sort of the chicken and the egg thing, of course. Walt Disney most likely named Pluto, the dog, after the planet because it was around the same time. No, she named it Pluto. Pluto's the god of the underworld. And that fitted in with the names of, there were some really weird names they were going to give to the planet. But Pluto came out well, and it was sort of also good because the P and L in Pluto, which is the abbreviation for it, is the first 2 initials of Percival Lau's name.
Right. Okay.
So that worked out really, really nice from that point of view.
Very clever.
Yeah. So she was only about 11 or 12 at the time. Her name was Virginia. And so she got the naming rights and everything else, and it was a bit of a kerfuffle. And so now we have the 9th planet. Now, in the 70s, we discovered it had a moon, a great big moon, actually, called Charon.
Was that moon on Pluto or?
The moon orbits Pluto like our moon. It's totally locked, just like our moon is, but it's significantly larger compared to Pluto than our moon is to us.
Right, okay.
And it was called Charon. And again, these are names to do with the god of the underworld still. They decided they're going to send a mission to Pluto called New Horizons. So this mission's all getting ready to go, and it takes quite a long time to put these space missions together. Because when the 2 Voyagers went out there, they went in 2 different directions, Voyager 1 and 2 in 77. And when they went out there, Pluto wasn't in the right spot because you have to have the orbiting. You had the great planetary alignment that was happening, which meant they could go and see Jupiter and Saturn, Uranus and Neptune. But of course, Pluto was sort of not in that particular orbit. So Voyagers never saw Pluto. So this was a mission to go to Pluto and beyond, hence called New Horizons. And along with this, they started looking using the Hubble Space Telescope, which went up in 1990, to actually look at Pluto and see what other moons it had. Because the last thing you want to do is send a spacecraft out there and collide with a moon you didn't know about. And they found 2 little moons called Nix and Hydra, which
How
also...
did they get their names?
Again, they're related to the god of the underworld.
Right, okay.
So everything's related to the god of the underworld. N for New Horizons, H, and N and H for New Horizons, Nick and Hydra. They're sort of like the dogs.
Right, okay.
And then they continuing along, and by this time it's 2006. And by this time we knew that there were planets around other stars. We'd also found an object out past Pluto called Eris. Now, when Eris was first named, the guy who named it was a keen follower of a certain New Zealand TV character called Xena, the Princess Warrior. You may remember her companion Gabriella. And Eris had a moon, and which is now called Disonia, but Eris and Gabriella. Of course, he put forward the idea that this object was actually bigger than Pluto. So here we are in a situation where we know there are objects out past Pluto. He's alleging it's larger than Pluto. Right. Mm-hmm. And we also know there's planets around other stars. Charbonneau had discovered the first planet around another star back in 2004, or the first confirmed planet. And so we have this problem. We need to define what a planet is. Now, most of us really don't care. A planet goes around the sun. We live on a planet. Pluto was a planet. So they had this great big vote. And seriously, I know very few people who claim to actually have voted at the meeting. The vote was around 2:00 in the morning local time. over in Germany, and many people were already on their way home. It was sort of the last vote of the conference. I think a lot of people just don't want to take responsibility. I don't have to take responsibility because I wasn't there, so I'm right. I also didn't even have my master's then, so I probably wouldn't have been allowed to vote anyway. They had a vote. So the definition, we need to define a planet. So the first three things they come up with are pretty non-controversial. One, a planet orbits the sun.
Right.
Okay. A planet has sufficient gravity to be round. Pluto ticks that. Pluto orbits the sun, and it's not a satellite, like it's not a moon of another planet, right? So Pluto fits that one. Now, where the problem comes into is the first 8 planets basically follow Kepler's laws very, very accurately. So they go around the sun, and basically they're in a plane. So they're only a little bit off that plane. So they're slightly elliptical, but they're pretty well sort of very civilized. They sort of stick together quite nicely and don't wander too far up above or below the orbits. But poor old Pluto, of course, because it's so far out and it's not exactly large. Did you know, in fact, if you put Pluto on top of the map of Australia, you'd have about 100 plus kilometres on each side.
Really?
So your Great Dividing Range would be fine on the east side. Perth and probably from Fremantle across would be fine on the west side. And it would fit nicely between Darwin and the Great Australian Bight. That's how small Pluto actually is.
Wow.
I just thought that was an interesting visual.
Very.
But anyway, so here we've got poor old Pluto, but his orbit is quite significant in that it's very, very elliptical. So elliptical meaning very, very odd shape, but it also is at an angle like that to the rest of the plane of the other 8 planets.
Right. So it's the odd one out.
Well, it was at the time. So we'll just touch upon that and go a bit further with that one. But anyway, so it's a little bit different. But also for 20 years, every 200 years, and the last time this occurred was 79 to 99, Pluto is inside Neptune's orbit.
Right.
So it's basically between 79 and 99. If you answered at school that Pluto was the 8th planet, you should have been given the answer correct, because at that time it was.
Right.
And so that's the problem, is the final definition of a planet was it had to have sufficient gravity to have cleared its own orbit. Okay. So basically Eris as well also intercepts with the different orbits, and many of the outer what we now call dwarf planets, what then we used to call Kuiper belt objects because they were beyond Pluto, now we call trans-Neptunian objects. So we just changed their names. TNO means it's past Pluto, past Neptune. Many of them also intersect with the different orbits of the other planets, particularly Neptune and Pluto. And so that's basically the rule. That's where Pluto failed the test. So Pluto got itself demoted in 2006. And of course, this is very devastating because this is about the time that New Horizons is about to take off to launch. And so here these guys have been preparing for their launch to the furthest planet. Now to find they're going out to the first dwarf planet. And so that was a little bit disheartening, I think, for them. And it caused massive furor. Late night TV was full of it. People got abusive letters on, kids wrote letters about Pluto being demoted. It was amazing that so many young people who weren't even around, forgetting our generation, got all upset about Pluto.
And I mean, I don't understand any of this, so I'm pleading ignorance. But what you're talking about is very fascinating. And for those people who are just starting out and to learn about the planets and the stars, the night sky, which is absolutely a fascinating area to learn about. And the wealth of knowledge that you have, Donna, is incredible. Why is it that someone has the power to demote a planet?
Well, it actually isn't the first time it's happened. So back in 1800, just after in the early 1800s, a fellow discovered some other objects. He discovered a thing called Ceres, C-E-R-E-S. I'll come back to Pluto again in a minute, but we'll talk about Ceres. Ceres is the largest of the asteroids. It's a round object shape as well.
Right.
Round object. And it's in the main asteroid belt. So it's between Mars and Jupiter, where the main asteroids are. And so he thought it was a planet. So it actually was a planet for a while. The problem is, and this is what happened with Pluto as well, he went on and discovered Vesta and a few other asteroids in that area. And so they decided they couldn't keep making all these guys planets. So it got demoted as well.
Oh,
So Ceres
right.
was actually the first planet to be demoted, and now it's actually been promoted again to being one of the dwarf planets, and it's actually the number one asteroid, and it's one of the main dwarf planets as well now, like Pluto. But Pluto's got loads of mates out there, and this is probably the justifiable reason. Now, do you remember having to learn the planets off by heart at school? And you made
Yes.
some little rhyme. What was
Yes.
your rhyme?
I can't remember.
So the one I learned was, my very energetic mother just sat upon Neptune's plate. Right. Now,
No,
what if you also had to add in other planets, like other objects like Aries, Quaoar, Varuna, Makemake, Haumea, Sedna, etc., etc. And the furthest object we found out is nicknamed at the moment Far, Far Out, and takes over 65,000 years to go around the sun.
Wow.
So you can kind of see the rationale that you couldn't, you're finding all these other objects, of course, plus around other stars. But the argument still that most people have is, fine, that's all right, make all those other objects dwarf planets and leave Pluto alone. Now, many people seem to have an idea lately that Pluto's been reinstated, but unfortunately, I must tell you, it hasn't been. So again, we've already identified it had 3 moons before the launch, and then in 2012, so they finally got to the spacecraft in 2015. The New Horizons spacecraft took the most amazing pictures, and by this time they discovered 2 more moons,
So
Keras and Cerebus, which are again dogs to do with the underworld.
Wow.
And so Pluto actually has 5 moons. We've got 1. Mars has got 2. Jupiter's got 79, Saturn's got 82, Uranus has got about 28 or 29, and I think Neptune's got 14.
Wow.
I need to be probably stand corrected on those last 2, because I keep finding new ones, you see. Poor old Pluto's got 5. And many of the planets, or the dwarf planets out past Pluto, also have 1 or 2 moons.
But Pluto's special.
Pluto's special because, again, I think it was the timing of its discovery and the fact that we all grew up with it being a planet.
Yes.
And because of various things, and it's always been shrouded in mystery. And then when New Horizons finally got there and we saw what an amazing planet it was, and the photos that got sent back to it before it went off to its next target, it was incredible. Yeah, I mean, I don't know why they couldn't do a grandfather clause in there and leave Pluto alone, but they didn't. But as I said, it's got loads and loads of new friends. But in many people's eyes, it's really upsetting.
Yeah, and maybe eventually they'll realise and bring it back to be one of the planets itself in its own right.
Most unlikely, but we can always hope.
Oh, well, you never know what can happen. If you talk about it enough and people understand it and realise it, and science, and that's what it is, the discovery of all these things might bring Pluto back into where it needs to be.
There's been many, many attempts to do so. One of the interesting things is, I don't know if you ever get the opportunity, but if you ever get the opportunity to look at old copies of encyclopedias pre-1930, pre-Pluto's discovery, then after Pluto's discovery, and then, of course, these days, and textbooks and things, just so you can read. It's sort of interesting reading what was, what is, and now what is to come.
Yes. Yes.
And, of course, then they'd have to republish a whole pile of new textbooks because they've only just rewritten a whole stack of them to demote the poor planet. So kids don't need to be worried. Pluto's got lots of friends.
Yeah, and 5 moons. Well, I didn't know that, and I've learnt so much today about Pluto, but not just about Pluto, but the other planets, because I'm going to say it's a planet, how many moons they have and all the rest of it. And I think that, Donna, the knowledge and skills that you have to share with us is incredible. So we're going to come back next week and do a Facebook Live, and we'll have another topic on something different. And we were looking at, what was it that you would like to talk about next week?
I thought we could talk about comets.
Comets.
I have a personal interest in comets. Comets, harbingers of doom. And one of the things we'll talk about is how Cayley's comet got excommunicated by the Pope, not the current Pope.
I want to say that Donna is known as the first woman to discover 2 comets. So
in Australia, only in Australia.
Yeah, well, in Australia, it doesn't matter. It's part of the world. Come and join us next week when Donna shares some more about our beautiful night skies. It is absolutely incredible. It's there for everyone to share. Nobody is not able to see the night sky. You can walk out and just look up, and it is absolutely beautiful. And the more I learn about the night skies, the more intrigued I am. And I really do look out at the skies now and have a better appreciation for them. So thank you so much, Donna. And I look forward to our next conversation on our Facebook Live.
Me too. Thank you, Faye.
Thank you.